The music that just played was from my opera Iphigenia in Weimar. In addition to my work in school and my interest in the heritage of Weimar, I also write music. I've written 3 symphonies and, as a part of this inquiry, I've just finished a 2.5-hour opera. I took a leaf from Goethe's Vine and prepared a text based on the Iphigenia myth. The libretto imagines Orestes and Pylades coming to Weimar in their eternal quest for Iphigenia and all that she represents. But rather than use the myth to express the ideas of the 18th century Enlightenment, I've used it to look at themes similar to those that I'll look at in the episodes of this inquiry. In the same way that Goethe used literature to express important issues of his time, I've wanted my opera to look at important global issues of today and to express them in a manner that's credible and in a way that has semantic legitimacy and validity. In a sense, in addition to all of the objectives I've already introduced, these episodes are an inquiry into the validity of meaning expressed in the opera, hence the title The Iphigenia Inquiry. I've come inside the Festsaal at the Weimar castle to hear a performance of another of my pieces. It's a beautiful place. Franz Liszt premiered several of his pieces here, including his first piano concerto in 1855, complete with full orchestra, with himself at the piano. The International School has organised a benefit concert to raise funds for its music programme, and a number of our parents who are professional musicians will be performing. There are several pieces on the programme, including Bach and Hummel, both who lived in Weimar. But there will also be a performance of a piece of mine, Tasman's Red Heart, for violin solo and pre-recorded sounds. While I'm waiting for the concert to start, perhaps it's worth taking several steps back to consider the nature of knowledge as it pertains to music and music performance and music experience. When Liszt wrote music for performance here and at other venues around Weimar, he wasn't merely producing innovative materials out of nothing. He was embroiled in a tradition that not only looked to originality and virtuosity, but that was also preoccupied with the meaning of music. It asked, what is music that it can so powerfully move the human spirit? I shall ask similar questions too. If idealists argue for a mind-dependent world, then I must look at what the implications are for the ontology of music. If social constructivists argue for the critical role of social dynamics in all communication, and music is taken as a form of communication, then I'll need to consider what this means as regards the aesthetic of music experience. If I was to say I like a certain piece of music, or alternatively not like it, what is it that I'm liking? Is it the experience I have while listening to that music, whereby the music is the course of certain mental states, a level 3 intentional process? Or is it the music itself, whereby music is some autonomous entity, independent of the mind, and somehow equivalent to the entity of mind, a level 1 being? I'll look at this issue in some detail when I get to the music of Franz Liszt. For now, I can say that the nature of music points directly to the matter of whatever interconnectedness exists between the human mind and the natural world. However, is music a physical entity, assuming the idealists are mistaken and there is such a thing as a physical entity in and of itself, or is music a mental entity, assuming music can exist as such a thing? The first approach, the physicalist approach, might claim that all music phenomena, such as pitch and dynamics, and even abstract objects such as melody and harmony, are existent entities. They can be pointed at in the composer's score, and thus demonstrated empirically as real objects. But on the other hand, an idealist approach would say that these would-be music phenomena are not entities in themselves, but references to mental states. Not only is the emotional weight of a piece of music attributable to the listener, even something like a melody is a construct created by the mind upon hearing a coherent sequence of pitches. This raises the question posed by idealists about the link between mental representations and the world beyond those representations. Idealists such as Kant, who had a strong impact upon the Weimar contribution to these matters, argued there is no world beyond representations, although a modern-day naturalist would most likely disagree. There is not a wealth of writing examining music from the perspective of naturalism, at least not to my knowledge, but one interesting approach, which also shows some affinities to the Weimar tradition, has been that of Josephson and Carpenter in their article, "What Can Music Tell Us About the Nature of the Mind?" The authors start with the hypothesis that there are parallels to be seen between the structures and mechanics of the natural world and the structures and mechanics of the mind, and accordingly the perception and interpretation of music by the mind. Specifically, the authors seek to identify links between the functions of genetics and musical ideas. They ask whether connections can be found in terms of biology, representing the physical world, and evolutionary biology, representing the mental world of mind and representation. They argue that the pattern and structure to be found in notated music parallels the cognitive structures that act to support evolutionary fitness. It's an argument similar to that used by Friedrich Schelling, who lived in Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach at the same time as Goethe and Schiller. Schelling posited that the beauty of pattern and structure enables deep cognitive insight into the qualities of organic unity, and that all knowledge is possible only because it's grounded in an innate sensitivity for natural generativity. I'll look at Schelling's work in more detail in due course, but for now I want to return to the ideas of Josephson and Carpenter. They give an example of these links in the Tristan chord and leitmotif, suggesting that the idea of a germ permeating subsequent development, as it does in Wagner's opera, parallels similar processes in the natural world. The authors draw parallels with the notion of mems introduced by Richard Dawkins. However, the authors concede that their approach cannot be applied universally. They acknowledge that many elements of music are not at all similar to natural processes. They assign these the rank of arbitrary patterns of sound. I think the authors will be able to find a lot of seemingly arbitrary patterns in my violin piece. But actually, the authors are not interested in arbitrary patterns. They're concerned with the special effects on consciousness of the specific constituent patterns or ideas found in good music. Good music? The article talked about skilled and mediocre composers being more or less able to use germs to develop good music. In other words, a good composer will use leitmotifs like Wagner in his Ring Cycle, and a not so good composer will resort to arbitrary patterns. I have to ask, tongue-in-cheek, whether they're alluding to something akin to Stockhausen's Licht Cycle as something that doesn't reflect parallels with nature. Professor Josephson is now director of the Mind-Matter Unification Project of the Theory of Condensed Matter Group at the Cavendish Laboratory, which is a physics department at the University of Cambridge. It's a project that seeks to understand intelligent processes in nature that are associated with brain function or other natural processes. And I'm entirely convinced by the titles alone that the professor is highly capable at physics. However, I've listened briefly to his music online, and I'm not so confident of his credentials on music aesthetics, which is a mental state privileged above all others in the arts. Well, it's regrettable when naturalists use notions such as evolutionary fitness to stray from biology and neurobiology into the realms of qualitative meaning and aesthetics, and toss around words like good, which I'm sure they would never do in their own discipline. However, in this case, given the anomalies, it's a relief to see that Josephson and Carpenter avoid reductionism, which has been the recourse of many of their colleagues, as I'll demonstrate later. Instead, they refute the possibility that physics and biology might be appropriate disciplines with which to study and justify music. They acknowledge that naturalism can act only in a descriptive sense to characterize parallels between aesthetic processes and life processes, such as the shared importance of adaptation seen in genes and musical patterns. And indeed, these ideas are not so different to the views of Goethe about the organic qualities of mind and nature I mentioned in the first episode. Josephson and Carpenter posit that biological processes are typically a means to an end, something that Goethe would have agreed with, and systems can be seen to act in ways that support their own requirements and those of other systems, which in turn help themselves. They go on to say that music does the same. Some aspects of music act as syntactical support structures, and others exist purely in terms of semantics. But in both circumstances, the music can be seen to adapt to context. The authors conclude, referring to the overall functions of mind, that intelligence would be the product of a collection of adaptations capable of being specified by a coding system related to that of music. I have no problem with the notion that mind is an evolutionary adaptation and that innate cognitive structures pertaining to perception, including the perception of music, may in some sense mirror other structures in nature that are also evolutionary adaptations. But this begs the question of what these structures might be. Nevertheless, it seems reasonable to suggest that the requirement to adapt might have common results. However, if I perceive a piece of music in a certain way due to the cognitive structures of my mind, or due to a transcendental deduction, as Kant would have called it, that doesn't imply that, when I'm writing a piece of music, I'm going to reproduce these same structures in my music. If human creativity depends upon reason acts, or even if the adaptation of aesthetics allows for the play of the imagination, as Kant described, then the results of human agency are almost certainly going to produce something entirely different to the structures of mind that created them. To argue that pattern and structure in music composition parallels cognitive structures is to make an ontological confusion between different levels of mind, between the cognitive processes associated with the third level of mind and the expressivity resulting from states of consciousness and self-reflectivity and the associated medium of human agency determined by the second level. Kant would have said the levels are integrated into a whole, but I'll look later at the problems of justification associated with this approach, and unless proved otherwise, I'm going to assume that these levels exist and act autonomously of one another. The problem in the Josephson and Carpenter paper is that, in discussing musical ideas, they confuse the experience of listening to and perceiving music content, which includes music concepts and judgments, with human agency that's able to create new musical ideas based upon additional factors beyond phenomenal and intentional judgment. As empiricists committed to an analytic methodology, they also make little mention of the social hermeneutical aspects of aesthetical judgments. Perhaps I should have paid a visit here. The Weimar tradition is unrivaled in the possibilities it presents for considering phenomenal experience vis-à-vis the efficacy of being in the world. It encompasses the metaphysics of mind and nature outlined by Goethe, Schelling and Hegel, to that of occasional visitors Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. It includes Steiner's role in the development of learning theory, and it includes a long tradition of art and music that features the Bauhaus and the contributions offered by Bach, Hummel, Liszt and other music composers. I shall look at aesthetics more closely later, but for now, at the conclusion of my 3 introductory episodes, I'm left with 3 broad questions pertaining to the Weimar tradition, learning cognition and music. Firstly, how do I justify my belief of what constitutes the critical concerns of today? And how do I justify expressing reconciliation through an opera? Secondly, how do I justify the continuing efficacy of Weimar, notably its representation of an idealist stance to the world? And thirdly, how do I justify an educational programme based upon these same considerations? These 3 questions have something in common, the issue of justification. And I'll look at issues of methodology in the next episode, but for now, the concert is ready to begin. So let's hear Friedemann Eichhorn play a short section of my piece for violin and pre-recorded sounds, Tasmin's Red Heart.